Hello, and welcome to a special crossover edition of the Dallas and Knots Landing Aftershows. So if you're listening to this, you could be a Dallas Aftershow fan of ours or a Knots Landing Aftershow fan of ours, but I decided to do something involving both shows because I remember what a big deal this was when this happened, when JR and Abby got together. Um, no, you have to understand, for those of you who weren't around back then, if you got into the shows later, when I was watching it live, when it was happening, this is when JR was making appearances on Knots Landing. And there was this whole storyline where he was trying to get this environmental engine thing that Sid Vega was getting. That part was whatever. I mean, that part was whatever the story. But it made sense for him to come out and try to get it. But meanwhile, bothering Gary, bothering Val, everybody's bothering him, and Karen had a little spark too. Karen would always stand up to him. But we're talking about the two villains of two separate soap operas, actually not only getting together and having scenes together, but they slept together. Like that was, I remember that was a big deal. I was like, that'd be like Alexis and Richard Channing from Falcon Crest, Alexis, Alexis, of course, from Dynasty, getting together, or JR and Alexis, or Blake and Abby, or it's just like it was a big deal to have two shows, even though it was a spinoff on the same network. All four soaps were all four soaps; they were their own separate thing. And I just remember being so shocked. And but JR and Abby made sense, and I'll tell you something. It was funny because JR had this twinkle in his eye when he did things, and so did Abby in her blue eyeshadow. She had her big feathered hair. He had a big, leather hat. They both had charm, and at first it was all about Abby would bat her eyes, and she would paint something off for Gary because Gary was considered weak, and he admired her. Now there's a scene where they're signing a contract. She draws up a contract to protect herself. And he admires that. He's just like, okay. And he doesn't read it. She's like, you're not going to read it? He goes, you won't mess up old JR. You won't screw her old JR. Like, she had a reason to screw him over. She just like, she wanted to protect herself. That made sense. And it was kind of like he looked at her as an equal, it seemed like. That he was amused by her. But she also saw what a big strapping man he was too. And she was amused by him. I thought and people forget that they actually slept together. You go online and see they slept together. So she's been with two Ewing men. Gary had all his problems still when he was on Knots Landing. But the thing about Abby and JR, they both were quick-witted, both charming. But I always felt like Abby didn't take herself as seriously. And she was more steeped in regular life issues than anything else. She was steeped. She had Knots Landing was much more of a suburban housewife show, so to speak. I know Desperate Housewives, right? A show where Dallas was over the top and big at that time. But somehow it worked, and it made me think, wow, what if Abby had shown up on Dallas years later? But of course, the Bobby Dream sequence killed all that. But I just thought it would be interesting if that would have happened if Abby and even on the reboot. I mean, JR wasn't, Larry Hagman wasn't feeling as well, but I don't know, there's so many possibilities. These two villains, anti-hero villains, who love their families. I mean, they did the things for their family. I feel like JR was a little more serious than she was. He had a glint in his eye too, and he loved, but I think he took himself really seriously in comparison to Abby. Abby took herself seriously too. She was a strong businesswoman, but she was always cracking jokes and things and being funny. So I don't know. I really was like, this is a great pairing that, I don't know, if two shows, like right now you have daytime shows. If two of the daytime villains got together, I'm like trying to think who's big right now. Okay, if Eric Braeden, who plays Victor Newman, slept with Kate DeMira on Days of Our Lives, that'd be very interesting. Or take my buddy Sean Kato, who plays Deacon on Bold and Beautiful. They brought him over to General Hospital. He was from General Hospital. He's been on Days. We're going to Days. He sleeps with Gwen or something. I mean, I think it's just one of those things where it's kind of like, I was in the old days, there was Stefano DeMira And there are certain people on Roger Thorpe on certain shows on daytime that you say you took one of those and brought them over to like All My Children, or one of them stuff with Erica Kane or things like that. That's equivalent, I think. But just thinking back to the Force, just thinking about it, those of us who remember this, those 4 soaps, Abby and JR was sitting together was very interesting. And I remember that scene, and Karen comes in afterwards looking for Abby, but she tells JR to shut up, which you like JR didn't even care. He was like, oh, okay. After the girls were fighting, and she just stands up to JR. I love it. I love it. I saw a little spark between Karen. She looked just like JR a little bit too. You can tell she kind of liked him a little bit. JR had that charm, and he had that big Dallas swagger. So anyway, but I always wondered what could have been if those two did more together, or if like JR came with Not Slanty a lot more, or if she went back to Dallas a lot more. I mean, it'd be very interesting. I'm James LottJr. I do 2 separate podcasts. I do the Dallas Aftershow, the Not Slanty Aftershow. This one I decided to do. There was both. Please, as usual, the Dallas groups, the Not Slanty groups, thank you so much. You guys are so wonderful talking about how you feel about it. Please tell me what your thoughts are on JR and Abby. And if you remember the scenes, like say you can go on YouTube and watch them too. If you remember them and how you feel, let me know. I'm James LottJr. and I'll see you next time.